This video was brought to you by Brilliant. The European economy is having a tough time at the moment. Growth is weak, inflation has only just fallen below the ECB's 2% target, and commentators are anxiously fretting about Europe's coming deindustrialization. But one other big issue is Europe's meager wage growth. Real wages are now down in the Eurozone, and European workers have fared worse than both their American and British counterparts during the inflationary crisis of the last few years. Not only is this, well, not fun, but it also means that, as the former ECB governor Mario Draghi recently pointed out, Europeans don't consume enough, and European companies have to instead export their stuff abroad, amidst rising geopolitical tensions. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the recent decline in European wages and try our best to figure out what might be causing it. So the first thing to say is that perhaps the most fundamental reason that European wages are so low, or at least lower than most of us might like, are that 1, productivity growth has slowed, and 2, wages and productivity have decoupled. In other words, even though workers are becoming more productive, their wages haven't been growing at the same rate. Now, neither of these are Europe-specific phenomena. In fact, in the past few decades, basically every advanced economy has struggled with both of these issues. As you can probably see from this graph, for instance, annual productivity growth has fallen in every G7 economy. The G7 average actually went from about 5% productivity growth per year in the 60s to between 2 and 4% in the 80s and 90s, before converging around 1% after the 2008 financial crisis. Similarly, this data from the OECD comparing worker productivity to average wages shows that wages and productivity have decoupled across the G7, with productivity rising faster than wages across the bloc. In the US, for instance, productivity and wages moved in tandem from the end of the Second World War until basically 1970, when they suddenly decoupled. According to data from the St. Louis Fed, since 1970, productivity has increased by 175%, while wages have only increased by 54%. As you can see here, wages and productivity have also been decoupling in the Eurozone since its inception in 1999, with real wages, i.e. wages adjusted for inflation, only increasing by 10% between 1999 and 2017, despite the fact that productivity increased by roughly 20% in the same period. This decoupling was particularly acute in certain Eurozone countries, like Spain and Germany. In Spain, for instance, productivity increased by 15%, but wages only by 5%, while in Germany, productivity increased by 25%, but wages by less than 10%. These phenomena are so widespread that they even have little nicknames. Economists often talk about the productivity paradox when referring to the recent slowdown in productivity, or the great decoupling when referring to the wider decoupling of productivity and wages. Now, the apparent severity of both the productivity paradox and the great decoupling depends massively on which data you use, and economists are still arguing both about which data is the most appropriate and the precise causes of these phenomena. Nonetheless, caveats aside, the fact that productivity growth has slowed and the fact that productivity growth no longer reliably translates into increases in wages are the fundamental reasons that wages across the developed world, including Europe, are so low. Nonetheless, European wages have fared particularly poorly recently. Eurozone wage growth has actually lagged behind the US and UK for the past decade or so, but the Eurozone has had a particularly tough time in the past few years. In short, the Eurozone, and Europe more widely, has suffered particularly steep real wage declines during the recent bout of global inflation. While almost the entire world experienced a sharp uptick in inflation between 2022 and 23, driven both by a spike in consumer demand post-pandemic and a surge in commodity prices after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, in many countries, workers were able to negotiate reasonably large pay rises to offset the increased cost of living. According to data from Indeed, US wages actually grew faster than inflation for most of 2022 and 23. And while workers in the UK did suffer real wage decreases in 2022 and 23, in part because the UK and Europe experienced sharper inflationary spikes than the US, UK wages quickly caught up with inflation. This just hasn't really happened in the Eurozone though. Nominal wage growth has been pretty weak and far lower than the UK, with wage growth peaking at just below 5% in late 2022, compared to a peak of just over 7% in the UK and over 10% in the US. And this means that Europeans have suffered from particularly steep declines in real wages. According to Eurostat data, real wages fell by 1.9% in 2021, then by 3.7% in 2022, for a total decline of about 6%. While real wages are now growing, they're not growing very fast, and in the aggregate, European real wages are still lower than they were pre-pandemic. Now, we should stress here that this is aggregate Eurozone data that masks significant intra-European variation. For instance, there was enormous intra-European variation in real wage growth in 2022, ranging from an 8.3% decline in Czechia to a 0.2% decline in Portugal, and in 2023 ranging from a 15.6% decline in Hungary to a 2.9% increase in Belgium. Nonetheless, in the aggregate, Europe has experienced some particularly stark real wage declines, at least when compared to their peer economies like the US and UK. So why is this? Well, this will probably require a whole other video, if not a whole economics textbook, but there are two reasons worth mentioning quickly. Firstly, Europe has suffered from higher inflation rates than, say, the US over the past few years, because it was more directly affected by the war in Ukraine and the accompanying disruption to energy supplies. Secondly, labour market reforms have made it harder for workers to negotiate higher wages from their employers. In short, over the past few decades or so, successive European governments have implemented labour market reforms that essentially try and make sure their companies are competitive. In other words, that their exports are cheap enough to compete with international alternatives. In practice, this has involved making it easier to hire and fire employees, and reducing union membership, which has fallen in most European countries, although this might have happened anyway. While these changes might have some positive consequences, a more flexible labour market might keep exports competitive and should also reduce unemployment, for instance, they've also made it harder for European workers to negotiate higher wages. This is one of the big reasons that Scandinavian countries, where union membership is more common, have seen relatively strong wage growth regardless. All in all, while solving this productivity paradox or reversing the great decoupling won't be easy, government policy clearly has some impact on wage growth, and Europe now needs to find a middle way between maintaining the continent's international competitiveness and bringing up wages to the point that European companies no longer have to rely so heavily on foreign markets. Now, as a TLDR viewer, it's clear you have a thirst for learning. Now, if you want to continue your learning journey, you really should check out Brilliant. Brilliant is the online learning platform where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. These hands-on lessons have you comparing circuits to understand voltage and current, playing snooker to learn the rules of collision, planning your itinerary for an intergalactic music festival on a space-time diagram, and much more. That way, you'll build your natural intuition while gaining deep knowledge of scientific principles. In fact, Brilliant recently added tons of new data science content, all of which uses real-world data to help you see trends and make better informed decisions. And don't worry, you don't need to be a world-renowned scientist to understand these courses either. Brilliant's courses are designed for learners of all levels. Find out more and try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR or clicking the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription by clicking our link. Thanks for your support, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.